This is Tunisia. It became the birthplace of what was called the Arab Spring, as hundreds of thousands of people fed up with decades of authoritarian rule and living in poverty, packed the street of their capitals in surreal scenes, chanting as one, "The people want to topple the regime." So what was Arab Spring and what changes it led in those countries after a decade? Arab Spring was a group of anti-government protests that ultimately resulted in the regime changes Middle East and North Africa in 2010 and 2011. It began in response to oppressive regimes and a low standard of living, starting with protest in Tunisia. From Tunisia, the protest then spread to 5 other countries: Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria and Bahrain. The Arab Spring is widely instigated by dissatisfaction, particularly of youth in unions with the rule of local governments. On December 17, 2010, a young Tunisian who sold vegetables from a barrow set himself afire to protest against police harassment. Mohamed Bouazizi died on January 4, 2011, but not before his gesture went viral, sparking protest against the cost of living in country's authoritarian president Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia, becoming the first leader of an Arab nation to be pushed out by popular protest. The protests inspired a wave of revolts across the Arab world as people rose up to protest against authoritarianism, corruption and poverty in their country, which led to fall of existing autocratic ruler. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak resigned on the 11th of February 2011 after 18 days of massive protests, ending his 30-year presidency. In Libya, meanwhile, authoritarian dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi was overthrown on the 23rd of August 2011, and was killed on the 20th of October 2011 in his hometown. On February 27, 2012, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had ruled Yemen for 33 years, handed power to his deputy Abdrabbu Mansur Hadi, after a year of protests. Mass protests demanding political and economic reforms erupted in Bahrain in mid-February 2011. Led by Bahraini human rights activists, protests were violently suppressed by Bahraini security forces. During this period, several leaders announced their intentions to step down at the end of their current terms. Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir announced that he would not seek re-election in 2015, as did Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, whose term was to end in 2014. Protests in Jordan also thrown out 4 successive governments by King Abdullah. The popular unrest in Kuwait also resulted in the resignation of Prime Minister Nasser al-Sabah's cabinet. The outcome of the Arab Spring in various countries was a wave of violence and instability commonly known as the Arab Winter or Islamist Winter. The Arab Winter was characterized by extensive civil wars, general regional instability, economic and demographic decline of the Arab League, and overall religious wars between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Although the long-term effects of the Arab Spring have yet to be shown, its short-term consequences varied greatly across the Middle East and North Africa. In Tunisia and Egypt, where the existing regimes were ousted and replaced through a process of free and fair election, the revolutions were considered short-term successes. This interpretation is, however, problematized by the subsequent political turmoil that emerged, particularly in Egypt. In other countries, particularly Syria and Libya, the apparent result of Arab Spring protests was a complete societal collapse. Libya has remained in a state of civil war, and 2 opposing governments effectively rule separate regions of the country. The civil war in Syria that began in the aftermath of the Arab Spring lasted for several years, forcing many to leave the country to seek refuge in Turkey, Greece and throughout Western Europe. Syria's war also contributed to the rise of the ISIS group. The long effect were repression of Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamic organization, rise of Islamist state building, and tension rise between Shias and Sunnis. The winners are leader with strategic understanding of region and the scheme for exploiting the chaos: Putin, Netanyahu and Qasem Soleimani. The Kurds of Iraq may be a beneficiary of the slow disintegration of the country, which no longer function as a unitary state. The losers are the status quo leaders. Some had to step down and others had to make major concession. The Palestinians, seemingly avoid the dynamic of Arab revolution, are also losers. So are the American president, whose disastrous strategic decision-making catalyzed Arab state fragmentation and opened the gate for Iran's drive for regional hegemony. Western democratic society too suffered from waves of Islamist terrorism and effective Muslim migration. Since 2011, the goals of many Arab Spring protesters have been denied as autocratic government regain power and crackdown on civil liberty. Nonetheless, the uprising have shown the power of mass demonstration and peaceful protest as well as the ability of social media. Now let's find out what had changed after a decade. A decade has passed since the December 2010 self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi. And it celebrate its 10th anniversary on the 17th of December 2020. After few years of starting of the Arab Spring, it seems to be a failure and things didn't change even now. For example, democracy had short-lived in Egypt and Libya. Only Tunisia made a lasting shift to democracy. Youth unemployment in the region remains the highest in the world and has worsened in several countries. Press freedom in the region is worse today than in the years before the revolts. Many governments have moved aggressively to suppress any criticism in the media, and foreign and local journalists are more likely to be imprisoned, killed, or have their work censored than their peers in most other regions of the world. Egypt has become one of the world's top jailers of journalists. Internet freedom is mostly stagnant or declining. Only Tunisia has increased internet freedom. Post-uprising civil wars in Libya, Syria, and Yemen have caused mass displacement. Syria's conflict alone has created more than 5 million registered refugees and over 6 million internally displaced people. Government corruption is unchanged or worsened. Over the last decade, some countries have seen slight increases in female representation in government, but generally the region has done little to improve the status of women. A new survey conducted across 9 Arab states has shown that people believe they now live in more unequal societies than before the Arab Spring, though most who were part of the survey did not believe the protests were a bad thing.
We do the revolution for jobs, for freedom, and for dignity. We obtained freedom, sure, but we're going hungry.
We believe a dialogue is still possible, and reforms are still possible. The yellow card is to say, attention. Today we have the same demands that we have been having for years. It's time to tackle the real problem.
At the end, the Arab Spring taught everyone that democracy, transition and political movement are not a spectator sport, but require accuracy, time, planning, and commitment to see them through.